Welcome to Magnifico Recaps. Today we will narrate a crime action movie called Taken. Spoilers ahead. So take care. The movie starts with Brian, a retired government agent. He is in an electronics store, choosing a karaoke machine for his 17-year-old daughter Kim. Kim's mother Lenore reacts very harshly to Brian as he arrives at the luxury mansion. Although the gift is very well received by her daughter, Stuart, her wealthy stepfather, quickly distracts her from Stuart's gift of an enormous horse. Brian later lives alone in his modest apartment. 3 of his friends, all retired agents, stop by to have beer, steaks, and poker. Sam invites Brian to help him make quick cash by working security and escorting a female pop singer to a nearby concert. Brian, after Shira's vocal warm-up, asks Shira what advice he should give his daughter Shira, who wants to be a singer. Shira replies, "Tell her that you have another career." Kim calls Brian inviting him to lunch. Things get anxious at the concert when security is distracted from a mob breaking through. Brian helps Shira get away from the crowd but is then confronted by a knife-wielding attacker that Brian quickly defeats. Shira says thank you and offers to help Brian's daughter, if she has any natural talent, with a vocal coach as well as a manager. Brian is excited to tell Kim about Shira's offer. However, Lenore also comes to the lunch and it becomes apparent that he was only invited to sign the parental consent form Kim needed to go on vacation to Paris along with Amanda. Brian refuses to consent, knowing the dangers in Paris and Kim's young age. Kim then explains that she will be staying at Amanda's cousin and spending most of her time in museums. Brian promises he'll think about it, but Kim sees it as a no, and is very upset. Lenore weeps at Brian for being too cautious. She wants her daughter to have a good time. Brian arrives at Stuart's house the next day with the signed consent, a prepaid international cell phone and certain conditions. Number 1, Brian must take Kim to Paris. Number 2, Kim must call Brian after she lands in Paris. Number 3, Kim must call Brian each night to give Brian the address and telephone number of the new place she will be sleeping. As Brian retrieves Kim's luggage from his car at the airport, he notices a map with many European cities in the pocket of Kim's luggage. Lenore confronts him and reveals that the girls will be following U2 on their European tour. They won't just stay in Paris. Brian is furious, but it's too late to change it. While waiting in line at Paris airport for a taxi, 2 young Parisians named Peter meet them. He suggested they share a taxi to take them downtown. Kim reluctantly agreed to Amanda's offer. While they wait for Kim to accept, Peter takes their picture using Kim's cell phone. Peter makes a show of chivalry and has the taxi drop off the girls first. Amanda enthusiastically accepts his invitation to a party. Peter calls quickly to find out the address of the apartment and 2 girls about 18. Kim asks Kim upstairs where her cousins are. Amanda announces breezily that the cousins are in Spain on vacation and giggles when she jumps onto the couch to announce that she will have sex later with Peter. Brian, back in the US, checks the arrival information to find out that Kim's plane had landed. Brian tries to call Kim's cell phone, but Amanda has turned up the volume in her apartment so that Kim's phone rings. Brian finally gets hold of Kim. Kim moves around the loft, which is shaped like a square with an enclosed courtyard between it, to better hear her father. Kim can see Amanda through the courtyard windows as they chat. While she is talking to her father, Amanda suddenly notices 2 men grab Amanda. They then take her away. Amanda fights and kicks. Kim panically tells Brian about what she saw. Brian quickly takes control of the situation and tells Kim to hide under the bed in the bedroom. He guides her through a series of carefully crafted questions and reveals that Kim and Amanda shared an Uber with Peter. Kim believes she saw at least 3 to 4 men take Amanda. He tells Kim that he saw 3 or 4 men take Amanda. They will take you. Brian tells her to leave her phone on and that she will be given 5 to 10 seconds to describe them. Brian connects a tape recorder with his phone. 2 men enter the bedroom, puzzled that they haven't found the second woman. They speak in a foreign language. Brian instructs Kim to point the phone at the men so that he can hear their conversations. Kim sees the 2 men have left the room. Kim is relieved, and she tells her father. Then suddenly Kim is taken from under the bed. She shrieks out, "Beard! following Brian's instructions. 6 feet right hand, tattoo, moon, star. Brian can hear her screaming for a few seconds more, and then Brian hears heavy breathing. Brian informs the kidnapper that Brian will not pursue him if his daughter is released immediately. The man will pursue Kim if he doesn't allow Kim to go. He cites his skills as an undercover agent. The kidnapper responds with a thick accent. Brian records the conversation and sends it to Sam, an ex-agency friend from that concert. Brian storms over to Stuart, his second husband, and confronts them about Stuart's business associates that arranged Kim's kidnapping. Stuart and Lenore were surprised at how much Brian knows about Stuart's business. Brian believes Stuart's business is not the cause of the problem and tells Stuart that he needs a private plane to Paris an hour ago. Brian looks through Kim's bedroom and her personal belongings to find clues. He is speaking on speakerphone with Sam, so Lenore hears. Sam gives a detailed report, identifying the language as Albanian. He even narrows down the accent to a specific area in Albania. Their leader is Marco, and he is very powerful. Sam informs Brian that the Albanians kidnap women for prostitution. Brian only has 96 hours, 4 days, to go before Kim disappears forever. Brian listens to the audio recording of Kim's kidnapping over and over, making sure that he retains every sound. Brian is granted access to Amanda's apartment in Paris for the first time. Brian visualizes Kim's abduction using the clues left at the scene. He then finds and retrieves the memory card from Kim's broken cell phone, which is next to the bed Kim tried to hide. Brian zooms in on Peter's reflection in the photo at a kiosk that allows him to do it himself. Peter uses the same share a taxi line at the airport with the blonde Swedish girl. Brian attacks Peter to learn about the girls from yesterday. However, Peter's accomplice and a large man try to stop Brian. Peter flees as Brian battles the man. Brian catches Peter's accomplice, and begins a chase to steal the taxi cab. Brian leaps out of a taxi to chase Peter on foot. Peter then runs into traffic. Peter jumps over an overpass, and he appears to land safely when a truck rams into him. Jean-Claude, an old friend, meets Brian to offer his assistance. The Frenchman informs Brian about the location of the Albanian pimped hookers, but warns Brian not to get into trouble. Jean-Claude creates a tail for Brian to follow as he leaves. Brian rents a car and meets an Albanian interpreter who he hired in the hooker area. He tells him to stay in the car until they reach Pigalle, Paris. Brian then wastes the time of a prostitute so that her pimp can come over and rough up Brian. Brian then cleverly places a listening device on her pimp. Brian then has an interpreter listen to the bug's audio feed and translate the conversation into Albanian. They discuss having problems with new merchandise at a nearby building site. Brian excuses Brian's interpreter but not before he has the Albanian English dictionary that he asked him to bring. There is a long queue of men waiting at the construction site to get into a trailer. Brian joins the line, acting as a customer. Brian is handed a piece of paper and $1 by the doorman when he reaches the top of the line. The trailer has been rigged with blankets over it to create rooms along one side of the central aisle. Brian looks into each room as he walks down the aisle. Brian walks down the aisle and enters one of the rooms to find a cot that has a drugged woman on it. Kim is not there. He refuses to come to her. This invasion of privacy creates a disturbance as each room has a customer. Brian must deal with several bouncers while he travels the length of his trailer. Brian finds his daughter's jacket in the last room. He also sees a woman with Kim-like hair and is drugged. He rushes in to find it's not Kim. Brian attempts to question the woman but she's so stupefied she won't speak. Brian takes her to a nearby jeep and hotwires it. After a wild chase, he escapes from an angry Albanian mob. He then drives to an out-of-the-way hotel, renting 2 rooms from his owner, another old friend. Brian sets up an IV drip in one of the rooms and injects Narcan to the girl. This begins a very rapid detox. Jean-Claude later demands a meeting at the river with Brian. Jean-Claude's cell phone rings when he arrives. Brian says he doesn't trust Jean-Claude until he has Kim back. Jean-Claude claims that his boss was a tyrant over the violence at the construction site. Jean-Claude persuaded Brian to be arrested and instead authorized Brian to fly back to America as a gesture of appreciation for his services. Brian declines. Jean-Claude's men are triangulating Brian's source of Brian's call. A squad of men storm onto a nearby roof. They find a phone with a walkie-talkie on it. Brian is actually under another roof. Brian easily walks away. Brian is able to recall the girl's story, and she tells Brian that she borrowed the jacket from another girl. She can only recall that it was at a house on Rue Paradis with red doors. Brian walks boldly and confidently to Jean-Claude's house with red doors. Brian is taken by several thugs to a dirty, cramped kitchen. 4 Albanians sit around a table. Brian attempts to determine who is the leader. However, they all claim that Marco is their leader and are all from the same town Brian's language expert identified. Brian informs them that Mr. Macon, their former police contact, has been transferred to him and that he will now be collecting the bribes. The rate has just risen. After much negotiation, Brian agrees to a deal and believes he has identified Kim's figure using Kim's mobile phone. Brian stops before he goes and tells him that a friend had given him an Albanian note. The leader asks Brian to translate the note and hands it to him. The leader replies, "Good luck." Brian immediately recognizes Marco and responds, "Good luck, I told you that I was going to find your house," and suddenly Brian is fighting the house of armed men. Brian killed Marco and all the others when the smoke cleared. Brian looks for Kim in every upper bedroom of the building. He discovers several women tied to their beds, and Amanda's body dead, apparently from a drug overdose. Brian uses electricity to torture Marco. Marco tells Brian Kim that he was sold to St. Clair after trying to make it work. Brian then switches the power off and Marco is left screaming in pain, likely to die. Jean-Claude returns home to find Brian visiting, and he is like an old friend. Jean-Claude's wife Isabelle tells Jean-Claude that he should put his 2 children to bed. He takes out a gun from the lavatory, and places it in his waistband. Brian talks casually about moving to Paris at the dining room table. He also mentions Macon's name and the address of an Albanian pimp house. Isabelle claims that Macon is her friend, but this is a naive claim. Brian confronts Jean-Claude about selling anonymity and protection to the Albanians. He demands to know St. Clair's identity. Jean-Claude then pulls out his gun and points it at Brian. He complains about the difference between his salary and his expenses. Brian throws a few bullets onto Jean-Claude's dining room table. He tells Jean-Claude that he has been sitting behind a desk for too long and can't distinguish the weight difference between a loaded and unloaded gun. Brian pulls out his gun and shoots Isabelle in her arm. Jean-Claude tells Brian that it is a wound to the flesh, but that he will not be able to identify St. Clair until he has more information. Jean-Claude then enters his office to access the police files that locate St. Clair. Brian tells Jean-Claude that he's sorry for shooting his wife and he pistol whips him to the ground. Brian poses as Jean-Claude again and is granted access to a St. Clair party. Brian discovers that St. Clair hosts a darker party on a lower floor. Brian takes on the role of a waiter to gain access to a darkened area facing a wall made of glass. This is one of several rooms that surround an open stage. A young, drugged and scantily dressed young woman is seated on the stage with a handler. Bidders can press a red button in each darkened cubicle to place their bids. The auction is over and the girl is taken away. The auctioneer announces that Kim is the last and most valuable woman in the auction. She is an American pure virgin. Brian draws a gun on the buyer and forces him outbid other bidders to buy her. Brian is knocked unconscious by the gunpoint buyer after the bidding reaches $500,000. He is suspended from a pipe at the ceiling and awakens. St. Clair, an Englishman, reveals to him that he is the father of the last girl. St. Clair says, "Too bad. It's business, and she is already sold." The henchmen are instructed to quietly execute Brian and he leaves the room. Brian, despite being tied to an overhead pipe, manages to free himself and escape with the help of his henchmen. Standing at the elevator, Brian is surprised to meet St. Clair. St. Clair attempts to save his life, but St. Clair says it was just business, and tells him that Kim will be at the pier. Brian shoots Claire and takes the elevator to the party. Brian races down to the river but misses the large yacht on which Kim and other veiled ladies have been hustled while it cruises along the river. Brian steals a car and drives it against one-way traffic to get a position on the Pont de Sorts bridge. He then jumps onto the boat as it passes beneath. An Arab sheik is seen lying on a bed covered in a robe while a group women wearing veils enter the room. Brian battles through the sheik's guards to enter the bedroom where the sheik holds a curved knife to Kim's throat. Brian fires and the standoff is over. Brian fires at the sheik, who begins to say we can negotiate, but Brian hits him in his head. Kim is now back in the USA with her mother. Brian is even hugged by Lenore in gratitude. Brian later mysteriously takes Kim to a very nice place. He takes a step back after he knocks. Shira, a pop star, opens the door to find someone at the piano. The movie ends with Shira grabbing Kim by the arm, saying that she heard Kim want to sing, and then tells Kim, "Let's see what we have."